The world was told a miracle had happened. $3 billion of African debt erased overnight. In Washington and Paris, news anchors smiled. They called it a gift. They called it hope. They told you history had been rewritten. But in Burkina Faso, Captain Ibrahim Traoré clenched his fist and whispered, "Behind their smiles, there is always a trap." What kind of trap? Listen closely, because this miracle may be the biggest deception of our time. The IMF wants you to believe that Africa was freed, but the contracts reveal another truth. They speak of collateral, not in dollars, not in credit, but in Africa's lifeblood: gold, oil, and uranium. One signature and 40% of a nation's oil revenues are gone for 10 years. Another and 25 tons of gold, worth nearly $2 billion, vanish into foreign hands. This is not relief. This is repossession, dressed in the language of compassion. And while the West celebrated, one man refused to join the applause. In Ouagadougou, Traoré asked the question no one else dared: what does Africa give away in return? This is not just another headline on African news. This is a turning point, a moment where one small nation looked past the cameras, past the press releases, and saw the fine print. Friends, if you value dignity over illusions, if you believe freedom must be defended, not gifted, stay with me. Because what you are about to hear may change the way you see Africa, the IMF, and the future of the world. The IMF called it a breakthrough. $3 billion in African debt, gone. Cameras rolled. Leaders in Western capitals smiled and posed for photographs. They called it partnership. They called it a new beginning. But buried inside the contracts was a different story. Technical terms, printed in fine ink, spoke louder than the speeches. Resource-backed. Commodity secured. To most people, these phrases meant nothing. But to those who signed, they meant collateral, not cash, not credit. Collateral in the form of gold, oil, and uranium. Within weeks, governments lined up to take the deal. One signed away 40% of its offshore oil revenue for the next decade. Another mortgaged 25 tons of gold, worth $1.8 billion at today's U.S. price, just to clear its balance sheet. The IMF smiled for the cameras. Western markets applauded. But in villages and towns across Africa, ordinary people asked a different question. Was this freedom, or another form of chains? In Ouagadougou, Burkina Faso's capital, Captain Ibrahim Traoré gave his answer. He refused to sign. He read the vague wording, he saw the soft promises, and he understood what others missed. Debt relief tied to resources was not generosity. It was repossession. For decades, Africa had lived through this cycle. Colonial treaties, austerity programs, structural adjustments. Always the same pattern. Wealth flowing out, dependency flowing in. Could this time be any different? Traoré decided it would be. Instead of celebrating, he created something unexpected, a secret financial investigation unit. This team of auditors, economists, and intelligence officers had one mission: uncover the hidden strings behind the so-called relief. They pored over the contracts line by line. They traced offshore accounts. They compared these new agreements with colonial documents from the past. And what they found was chilling. The same pattern, the same extraction logic, only hidden under new clothes. The old empire had not disappeared. It had simply learned to speak the language of finance. One clause demanded repayment not in cash, but in barrels of oil, delivered at prices 30% below the global market. Another clause said that if gold prices rose, additional liabilities would appear automatically. Heads, the creditors won. Tails, Africa lost. Imagine this: Oil trading globally at $75 a barrel, but the contract forces delivery at only $50. Over 10 years, that gap alone could cost billions, money stripped directly from Africa's future. Traoré read these terms and saw the truth. What the IMF called relief was, in fact, a pawnshop deal. Nations were trading sovereignty for a short-term illusion. Yet the West continued its show. Headlines glowed, analysts praised innovation. But inside Africa, suspicion grew. Students in Dakar debated the meaning of sovereignty. Journalists in Lagos compared the contracts to pawn tickets. Economists in Nairobi calculated the long-term losses and called it surrender. In Burkina Faso, however, silence spoke louder than applause. Traoré stood firm. No signature, no compromise, no pawned future. And then came the breakthrough. His investigation team uncovered something even darker. A leaked dossier stamped Phoenix Dollar Commodity Stabilization Program. The plan was shocking. It revealed that advisors around former U.S. President Donald Trump had designed a digital dollar backed not by innovation but by Africa's resources, gold, oil, uranium, all penciled in as collateral to fight China's rising digital yuan. The document showed that just 5 African countries could underpin $500 billion of this new digital currency. Burkina Faso's uranium alone, valued at over $2.7 billion in U.S. markets, was marked as a strategic stabilizer. In other words, the so-called debt relief was never about Africa's dignity. It was about securing the raw materials for a financial war. The IMF smiled for the world, but Traoré saw through the mask. Friends, ask yourself this. Can a gift still be called relief if the price is your nation's soul? The day of silence ended in a storm. After months of gathering evidence, Captain Ibrahim Traoré made his move. Before a packed hall in Ouagadougou, cameras rolling and microphones trembling, he unfolded the contracts page by page. Every clause, every hidden trap was read aloud for the nation to hear. And then the final blow. He held up the leaked Phoenix Dollar dossier, its cover stamped with the names of advisors close to Donald Trump. His voice did not waver. This is not debt relief. This is theft disguised as generosity. They seek our gold, our oil, our uranium, not to erase our burdens, but to mint their own digital empire. The reaction was electric. Across Burkina Faso, families crowded around TV sets. Farmers in remote villages shook their heads. Teachers replayed clips in classrooms. Traders in the Grand Market gasped at the numbers. Gold valued in New York at $2,450 per ounce was being taken from African nations at just $1,650. Oil sold globally at $75 a barrel was mortgaged away at barely $50. What citizen hearing those figures could mistake relief for anything other than exploitation? Shock turned to fury. On social media, hashtags ignited. Hashtag not relief but robbery. Hashtag Phoenix Dollar Trap. Within hours, the speech spread across WhatsApp groups, was remixed into songs, and painted onto protest banners. One clip went viral. An old man in Burkina Faso stood before a crowd and said simply, "I would rather my children inherit debt than inherit slavery disguised as relief." His words, translated into dozens of languages, became a rallying cry. The streets answered. In Ouagadougou, thousands marched with signs reading, "Our resources are not for sale." In Bamako and Niamey, students filled avenues chanting that Africa's sovereignty was worth more than erased debts. In Lagos, journalists held live debates, line by line, clause by clause. Even in Johannesburg, protest banners appeared outside banks accused of brokering the deals. Western capitals scrambled. Editorials in New York and Paris dismissed the revelations as political theater. Yet, behind closed doors, concern grew. Analysts warned that if just a handful of African nations refused IMF contracts, the entire $3 billion program could collapse. Commodity futures began to tremble. Donald Trump went on television. He called Traoré reckless, a radical soldier out of his depth. He accused Burkina Faso of sabotaging Africa's future. French networks went further, branding him anti-West and hostile to investment. But every insult backfired. The more the West attacked Traoré, the more Africans rallied behind him. Citizens who once ignored international finance now became amateur auditors. Students projected the Phoenix documents onto university walls. Labor unions declared that no worker's sweat should be collateral for foreign currency. Farmers' cooperatives issued statements rejecting IMF contracts. The movement was no longer just about Burkina Faso. It was about Africa. And it was about dignity. Western embassies reported protests outside their gates. Placards carried a clear message: better hungry and free than full in chains. Inside Africa, a new unity began to form. Ministers from Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger met in secret. They pledged to defend one another against financial retaliation. They discussed pooling gold reserves, negotiating with BRICS, even exploring blockchain systems to escape Western control. Meanwhile, the financial markets shook. Gold futures spiked. Uranium contracts surged 18% in a week. Traders in London and Paris grew nervous. Could a small group of landlocked nations really hold Wall Street in suspense? And so, friends, the story shifted. What began as IMF headlines turned into a continental storm. What began as silence in Ouagadougou became a voice echoing across Africa. But the question remains: could one leader's defiance and one continent's outrage actually force the IMF, Washington, and Brussels to retreat? The revelations did not stay on paper. They spilled into the streets, into classrooms, into village squares. Ordinary Africans, who had long seen global finance as distant and untouchable, now saw the truth in plain numbers. In Burkina Faso, mothers gathered in markets whispering about the contracts. One said, "They tell us 3 billion erased, but they want our gold. What kind of freedom is that?" In Nigeria, a teacher held up photocopies of the Phoenix dollar dossier during class. "This is today's lesson," he told his students. "Understand this because it is your future." The economic pressure was immediate. Gold prices in New York surged to $2,600 per ounce as investors feared African suppliers might withhold exports. Uranium contracts in Paris rose 18% in a week, threatening Europe's nuclear energy supply. Oil traders in London added risk premiums, worried that barrels from the Sahel could be redirected elsewhere. For the average African, life was already difficult. Prices of food and fuel rose as markets panicked. Traders speculated. Imports grew more expensive. But alongside hardship came something new: pride. People no longer spoke of being helpless. They spoke of standing firm. In Ouagadougou, a taxi driver put it simply: "If the West is angry, it means Traoré told the truth." His words spread across social media, becoming a slogan for resilience. Politically, the fallout spread fast. Niger announced it was suspending IMF participation. Mali declared its gold would never again be collateral for foreign loans. Soon even larger economies, Nigeria, South Africa, Algeria, announced reviews of IMF agreements. Each withdrawal was like a domino falling. Inside Brussels, a confidential memo leaked. "Africans caught us." In Washington, Trump raged, demanding sanctions, asset freezes, restrictions on exports. "If they don't want relief, they will feel the consequences," he said. But instead of fear, his words ignited defiance. Demonstrations grew. Placards read, "Better hungry and free than full in chains." Farmers carried empty rice bowls as symbols of dignity. Musicians in Bamako composed songs mocking the Phoenix dollar. Artists in Lagos painted murals of Africa breaking golden chains. What began as outrage turned into a cultural movement. Sovereignty was no longer an abstract term. It was a song, a mural, a chant on the lips of ordinary people. Yet the risks were real. Western media painted Traoré as reckless. Analysts warned of sanctions. Economists predicted investment flight. Families worried about shortages. Was this the price of freedom? Could dignity alone fill empty stomachs? The Sahel Alliance, Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger tightened ranks. Ministers met in Bamako. They pledged to protect each other from retaliation. They even discussed bold alternatives, pooling gold reserves, negotiating directly with BRICS nations, and testing blockchain-based systems to bypass Western banks. For the first time in decades, African nations were not fragmented at bargaining tables. They were standing as one. But unity is fragile. Could these nations survive if Washington and Brussels unleashed their full power? Would sanctions break them? Would markets crush them? Or had the people discovered a weapon stronger than financial chains? Conviction, shared across villages and capitals alike. Friends, the storm had only just begun. The IMF and Western leaders were shaken, but the greatest question remained. How would America and the wider world respond to this defiance? In Washington, alarm bells rang. The Phoenix Dollar Plan, once presented as a bold strategy, now faced collapse. Without Africa's gold, oil, and uranium, the foundation of the digital dollar crumbled. Donald Trump escalated. He demanded sanctions, asset freezes, and restrictions on African exports. His message was blunt. If they refuse relief, they will feel the consequences. Yet his threats produced the opposite effect. Across Africa, people rallied, chanting, "Better hungry and free than full in chains." In Brussels, panic spread. European leaders depended on uranium from Niger and Burkina Faso to fuel nuclear reactors. French newspapers warned of strategic vulnerability. Energy analysts estimated that rising uranium costs could add billions to household energy bills across Europe. Citizens began asking, had their governments trusted too much in African resources without respecting African sovereignty? Markets trembled, gold surged, oil contracts shifted. Hedge funds debated whether Africa's resistance could set a precedent for South America or Southeast Asia. If debt relief could no longer serve as leverage, what tools remained to maintain Western financial dominance? For the first time, Africa was not seen as a passive recipient. It was a decisive player. And the message from Burkina Faso was clear. Independence cannot be measured in erased debts, but in preserved resources. This new reality unsettled the old order. Wall Street watched commodity prices nervously. European capitals whispered about energy shortages. Washington realized that sanctions might unite Africa instead of breaking it. Friends, consider this. Could a small, landlocked nation, led by a young captain in Burkina Faso, have rattled the pillars of global finance? Could Africa's refusal mark not just a local protest, but the first tremor of a new world order? The storm that began with one refusal in Ouagadougou spread across an entire continent. What the IMF once called $3 billion in relief collapsed like a house of cards. What Washington and Brussels praised as partnership was unmasked as repossession. Yet the struggle is not over. Sanctions may come, markets may punish, shortages may grow. Families may suffer in the months ahead. But for the first time in a generation, Africa stood and said, no. We will not mortgage our future. At the Bamako summit, the Sahel Alliance, Burkina Faso, Mali, Niger, spoke with one voice. Alone, they can sanction us. Together, they cannot break us. Their gold reserves, their oil, their uranium, worth tens of billions, are no longer bargaining chips. They are shields of sovereignty. But friends, ask yourself, is Ibrahim Traoré a hero who defended Africa's dignity, or a danger who defied the world order? Is this the dawn of a new independence, or the spark of greater turmoil? The truth may take years to reveal, yet one lesson is clear. True sovereignty is not measured by loans forgiven. It is measured by the courage to refuse when refusal is just. For the people of Burkina Faso, the choice was not between comfort and suffering. It was between chains and freedom. And they chose freedom. Now the question turns to you, the viewer. What lessons can your nation learn from this stand? Would you trade dignity for temporary relief? Or would you endure hardship to protect the future of your children? If this story moved you, do not let it fade. Save it, share it, speak it, because freedom, once spoken aloud, must be echoed until no one can silence it. And so, as the cameras fade and the world looks elsewhere, remember the voice from Ouagadougou, a voice that said, behind their smiles, there is always a trap. And perhaps, in that warning, lies the beginning of Africa's true independence.